because I realized every week I could write about what I wanted to, and it was just refining my essay writing skills. And there was some guidance, but it was also very independent, and that's what I really like about the course here at Cambridge. The fact that you get to make up your own timetable, you get to choose what lectures you go to. You don't have to do anything that's compulsory, anything that you're not interested in particular.
Hello everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. Today we're here with a new guest. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Nadia, a third-year English student here at Trinity Hall.
Nice. So today we're going to be talking about studying English at Cambridge. So Nadia, can you tell us a bit about how you came about choosing to study English at Cambridge?
So for me, I've had this love-hate relationship with English being taught to me. I love reading, and I've always loved reading for a very long time, but I didn't really like the way that English was taught at GCSE and A-level. I found myself kind of hating the subject because you have to do exams and it's like a memorization game rather than really enjoying the literature, reading what you like, if that makes sense. And so I was quite stuck. I was like, oh, I don't want to really do an English degree and have to kind of go through the same thing of not having freedom. I can always read what I like and kind of study literature independently. And that was kind of my initial thought process. So I was considering other degrees, kind of areas I've never explored before, because I thought if I'm going to apply to Cambridge, I'll get taught and be equipped with the skills to explore different subjects. So I was considering Asian Middle Eastern Studies instead. But when I got here, and I got really jealous of English students, and I was like looking at the readings and the kind of course structure at Cambridge, and I realized it gave me much more freedom than GCSE and A levels. So I decided to pick English because I realized every week I could write about what I wanted to, and it was just refining my essay writing skills. And there was some guidance, but it was also very independent, and that's what I really like about the course here at Cambridge. The fact that you get to make up your own timetable, you get to choose what lectures you go to. You don't have to do anything that's compulsory, anything that you're not interested in particular.
So was there a lot more freedom compared to like studying in English at A level?
Yeah, so at A level, you have set texts. So you study kind of a Shakespeare, I did Hamlet, you do set texts that your teachers teach you. You don't really, there is a degree of exploration, there's a degree of you bringing in your own original ideas and stuff, but you don't really get to take a book off your own personal bookshelf and think, okay, I really want to look at this from an analytical perspective. But with the course here, even within set papers that you have to do, you can do any of your questions in the exam on a book that you like in particular. So you get to kind of find your niche academically with English in particular. I think about my class and how we all have a range of interests, and no supervision will be the same with any of us in it because we all choose very different topics.
Nice. And do you know how the English course at Cambridge compares to the course structures of like other universities?
I think English more broadly across universities, it's definitely one of those subjects where you are much more independent in your studies. I think what's quite useful about Cambridge is that you have this one-on-one interaction with professors, and you get instant feedback on your essays because you are constantly writing. So you get a lot more practice at essay writing and how to articulate your ideas. Whereas at other universities, you might have coursework at the end of the term. You have a lot more coursework in your first term. You'll have like an essay due 4 weeks in at the end of the term, and that's independent work that you do yourself. You attend lectures, etc., but you don't have a weekly interaction or a weekly essay to write. And for some people that works really well because they'd rather kind of spend their own time really refining an essay, whereas other people might want to kind of have consistent practice every week. So it depends on the level of engagement you want with your studies across a term.
Yeah, so am I right in thinking that, I can't speak for all universities, but for a lot of universities, it's like at the end of your term or semester, you would submit a long essay that would contribute to the degree, like go towards the degree. But in Cambridge, throughout the terms, you're week by week writing essays after essays, really.
Yeah, so at Cambridge you have the standard for English is like an essay a week that you write within the range of, I guess, like 1,500 to 2,500 words. And those supervision essays don't contribute towards a grade.
Yeah.
So it's just practice, and the stakes are relatively low. So in my head, I'm always like, it's better to have an essay done and have a really good, productive supervision conversation than perfecting the essay itself. Whereas at other universities, I guess the stakes are slightly higher at the end of a term or during a term because the work you do contributes to a grade. But at Cambridge, the time that, I mean, for English specifically, in your second year, your exams in the last term, which is called Easter, that amounts to 30% of your degree. And then your exams in your third year of Easter amount to 70%. So the stakes get higher in that final term where you actually sit exams or you have deadlines that you have to submit your dissertations on. But throughout the year when you're actually studying, there's no stake in your grade. So you get to kind of study and actually enjoy it at the time and then come back to things you liked in revision.
Nice. And you were touching on supervisions there. Can you explain a bit about what supervisions are, and is that the time when you go through your essays?
Yeah. So for example, last term my essays were due on a Tuesday, and I would submit my essay on a Tuesday, and then on the Wednesday I would have a supervision. And your supervisions are typically with 2 or 3 other people. At Trinity Hall and within my class, we confer amongst ourselves about what our essays are about, and then we email our supervisors with kind of the pairings, just because it's nicer to have a supervision with someone you have written an essay with, similar to.
Yeah.
And then we were given the times for potential supervisions on Wednesday. So you can have a supervision at 2, a supervision at 3, a supervision at 4, and that lasts an hour. And so we'll confer amongst ourselves, we'll pair ourselves up. Oh, you've done an essay on Dryden this week. Okay, I did a similar essay on like satire. Why don't we do our supervision together? And then for that hour, you go through either some of the set reading that your supervisor has set for that particular week, whatever topic you might be doing, and then you go through your essays. We swap our essays as supervision partners. So I read my supervision partner's essay and they read mine. And so we kind of usually start off with I like this about your essay. I was intrigued by this concept. And it's just a conversation really, but it's a really valuable conversation because you get feedback on your essay writing structure verbally, as well as your essay sent back to you with comments. But you get to have a conversation about what you liked about like studying a particular topic, and if any questions you have, you can ask, and you're taught by someone who's very well versed in this particular period. So
so even though you read your supervision partner's essay, there's also an academic who's running the supervision.
There's an academic who's running the supervision, and typically it's one academic that you'll be working with for one paper. So you get to build a rapport with them. For example, my DOS Jane partner, she supervised me for Renaissance, and Jane is obviously an early modern specialist. And so you get to know kind of what does Jane really like. And if you write an essay this week, you know that Jane will kind of like, oh, I love Andrew Marvell. I'm so glad you wrote about him. And that's because I built up this rapport with this supervisor in particular. So I know what she likes, and it's fun to do that. And so you always have a academic in the room who's guiding you through the content in a very kind of careful way, but it's always driven by you and what you've written. It's never really like imposed on you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that sounds really cool, and especially about how you would read your partner's essay and they would read yours. Was that like something that was the academics like idea to get you guys to do?
I think my class in particular, we started doing it. I think we came up with the idea because we thought it might be useful to actually have supervisions where the partners have done similar topics, and we can have like a very fruitful conversation rather than one person being silent when the other person is talking about their topic. But it's continued throughout our like 3 years. We began doing this in first year, so now in third year our class we still constantly swap our essays. It's really nice to kind of have a look into the ways that other people are writing, and it always reminds you that an essay can be written anyway in English, and there's no real standard, which is again another big jump from A-level. In A-level, there's like a structure that you should follow, despite your teachers telling you that it's all about flow. Whereas at degree level, you can structure your essay in any way that's coherent, and people could get the same marks, etc.
Nice, wow, that's really cool. And like I think it's a bit of a broader point, but I remember at university like directors of studies saying that the cohorts that work together tend to like perform better because they've like instead of like doing it on your own, you have multiple brains working together?
Yeah, so our DOS in first year, in our first term, he told us that I'd rather you guys help each other and kind of become a very cohesive cohort. You're not in competition with each other.
Yeah.
And it's all about helping each other. And I think that that's been a quite nice feature. We will message on our little group chat with kind of advice or things to read, or just generally have a quick chat after supervisions. And it's nice to like not feel like you're competing with your supervision partners.
Yeah, because I can imagine if you're like trying to find something in a reading non-stop, someone else just might have covered that already and you can just ask and it saves a lot of time.
Like, for example, sometimes there's a lot of reading and you might not have been able to read everything. And so before the supervision, we'll quickly confer, we'll say who's read what specifically. And that's always useful because everyone gets like their moment to shine and we work together to navigate the content.
Nice. That's really cool. And something quite unique to Cambridge and Oxford because like that kind of culture then leads into fruitful supervisions. So going back to the English course, could you explain to us briefly what the course structure is like at Cambridge?
So at Cambridge, you have part 1 and part 2.
Okay.
Part 1 spans the first 2 years of your degree, and it's split into part 1A and part 1B. And during that, you cover, I guess, not the entirety, but what hopefully should cover a substantial amount of English literature. And so you have compulsory papers that you need to study, and that begins with medieval, which is paper 4, and then paper 5, which is early modern, Renaissance, 1500 to 1700, I think. And then you have paper 6, which is the very long 18th century, and then paper 7, which is 1860 to the present day. And you study those 4 papers in 4 terms across the first 2 years. And then at the end of your second year, you'll sit 3 exams, and then one of those papers is substituted for a dissertation. That's 5,000 words in your second year. And so you have kind of four components that make up your 30% at the end of that year. And at Trinity Hall, we begin with paper 7. So it's kind of what you'd be most used to reading wise. It's a very nice entrance into the English course, whereas other colleges begin with medieval because there's a lot of us across different colleges that make up the English cohort, so we need to kind of split who does what paper in what particular term.
So which one's paper 7?
Paper 7 is the one that it's like the most modern of the papers.
The most recent. Okay.
The most recent. Yeah. So it's from 1860 to the present day, but there's 7A and 7B. 7A is 1860 to 1945, then 1945 to the present day. But you can choose what part you'd like to answer upon in your exam, or if you substitute with a dissertation.
Nice. And with module choices, is there any overlap with like modules that someone might be studying in like a different humanities degree, whether that's like, I was saying, art history or classics?
So there's quite a lot of different departments overlap into English.
Okay.
And then it's not very rare. There are quite a few English students who choose to take a paper from French, for example, or one of the students in my class is taking paper from ASNAC and is doing Welsh. And so it's very individual. It's a very individual choice. You have to be thinking about it a lot before you switch and take a paper from a different department. There's quite a range of departments that take papers from us. In particular, education. I have quite a few friends in education who are doing English papers in their second and third year.
Nice. But Cambridge does provide the opportunity for students to take papers from other courses.
Definitely. I think it's very common for people to take papers from, in particular, language courses.
Yeah.
For example, if you did like an A-level in Spanish or French and you really wanted to continue that, there's always a room to kind of make that work with you and your DOS. But there's no strand in particular that you could choose. It's very much you as an individual. If you're interested in this, you should like register your interest, speak to your DOS about doing that, and figure out how to timetable that.
Nice. Yeah, because we've got a question later on about translations, but I guess we can talk about that now. So say if a student, like they want to study English, but they also really enjoy literature from authors that didn't originally write in English, would they be able to choose modules that would they be able to read translations?
Definitely. I think so that the rubric for the papers that I just mentioned is that you have to write about English literature,
Yeah.
but only around 50% of an essay has to be about English literature directly, if that makes
Okay.
sense. So there's scope to bring in translation in those papers as long as it's not overpowering the actual kind of compulsory element of those exams. In addition to that, you can always take papers from different departments if you're particularly interested in translation. I think what's quite valuable, because I'm someone who before university really enjoyed reading translated fiction,
Yeah.
hence why I was struggling making the choice between English and another course.
Yeah.
But what I've now realized upon reflecting is that having a good basis in literary analysis that you develop over the course of the degree, it's quite valuable to then apply that to translation studies, and it's often kind of having strong literary analysis skills as a basis of translation studies. And so even if you're not studying translation directly, it's always kind of pushing you in the direction of being able to make a very good comment on translation. And actually in paper 4, which is the medieval paper, you get to engage with translation yourself. So in part 1 of the paper, you have to translate some Middle English into modern English. And that's when you first start thinking about the politics of translation. What are you doing when you change a word here? What are the grammatical changes you're putting in place when you make it modern?
Nice. Because I guess in that paper you have to do you have to like translate like the language from like Middle English or to the modern day English?
Middle English to modern day English. And so it's a set text for that. So you become familiar with it in your supervisions, and you have supervisions on translating. And then in your exam, you're asked to translate a couple lines and then comment on a couple translations from other people. And that's quite a very nice kind of introduction into translating analytically, and you're doing it with something you don't have to have another language in order to do that in particular, because it's English, so it's very accessible to everyone.
Nice. And even outside of translations, I guess, as you meant, am I right to think that if someone wants to mainly study English, but as you said, they did, I don't know, French A level, Spanish A level, they can choose a module from one of those departments and then read literature in those languages?
Yes, there's quite a few people who did some French ones. I was in some seminars where people kept mentioning this one French paper that they did about film. I was really jealous. I was like, oh, maybe I should have done something exciting like that. There's also the option of, we have a languages centre at Cambridge where if you wanted to, you could take language classes. So that's outside of your degree itself, but it's quite valuable. And a lot of people have benefited from that. So if you did a language to A level, but you don't want to do a paper for it, you don't want it to have kind of any bearing on your degree, but you wanted to develop your skills just for yourself, you can always choose to do a class with Language Centre. And I know that different colleges assist with payment for that, etc.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah, my friend of mine, he did Russian in the Language Centre, and then actually ended up choosing he was studying history and he chose a Russian paper, and his sources were in Russian, and was able to use the Language Centre, but then use what he learned in his degree, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a nice build-up because you get to do it with no stress, I guess, and then actually integrate it into your degree itself.
Nice. With the English course at Cambridge, you hear this phrase a lot called practical criticism. And for any prospective students or outsiders, can you explain like what practical criticism is and like what part does it play in the English degree?
Yeah, so practical criticism, or what a word, it refers to a very formalist approach of reading. And so over the course of your 3 years at Cambridge, you will always have a practical criticism class once a week. And that's kind of the standard of supervision for practical criticism. Regardless of what term you're in, you will have practical criticism, aside from Easter when you're like in exam period. And it's essentially interacting with pieces of literature completely unseen and just analysing what's on the page. And the idea came from I.A. Richards, who was a Cambridge critic, and what he would do with his students is he would give them poetry, prose, and he would ask them to analyse it, but give them no inclination of who the author is. Perhaps what would be on the page is the year that it was written, and you might be able to piece together some context from the timeline of it being written. And it's an exercise in close reading. So it really hones your skills as a critic, looking at what's actually on the paper. And practical criticism then feeds into your other papers, because all of your papers have to include a degree of close reading. You have to quote, you have to analyze them. And so practical criticism is just bolstering those skills. But it's very similar to, I guess, at A-level and GCSE having an unseen paper. My A-level, we did our unseen period on Gothic literature, so I knew what Gothic tropes were, but I would be given a new piece of Gothic literature, and I would kind of have to apply my knowledge of the Gothic to the unseen. It's similar in practical criticism, although you're not doing it for a particular kind of period or topic. You're trying as much as you can to cover a vast period of literature and apply those skills. And then the second part of practical criticism, it's actually practical criticism and critical practice.
Okay.
And so critical practice is the second element, where you engage with literary theory and try to implement that as well in your reading of new pieces. So you might get, I think last time we had a class on species dysphoria and kind of eco-criticism, so applying this theory of eco-criticism to different extracts, and we looked at a bunch of poems about ants and insects and stuff, and it was really strange, but it's all this exercise to get you thinking like a literary critic.
Nice. So just for anyone who's like listening, so what would like the opposite be of practical criticism? Or like, say if you're doing a course, because I think it's a Cambridge specific thing, practical criticism, what, like, if you're doing a course that doesn't have that, what kind of things would you be missing out on?
I think you'd be missing out on really refining those skills. I think practical criticism is something that Cambridge students still struggle with up until their third year.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a self-professed, like, not a big fan of practical criticism as a concept. Not as a concept, it's quite difficult. So I think what you're missing out on by not doing it is, well, I'm going to just restart that whole thing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I can edit it.
I think the difference between not doing practical criticism is that you don't get the practice of it. You aren't consistently thinking about how to remove a piece of literature from its context. And I think you fall into the trap of putting context on a pedestal when you don't look at things very closely. So there's a range of critics who talk about how you should always contextualize and never forget the context of literature. But I guess the baseline of any analysis is what's on the paper before who's written it. And I think that's a very key concept that you might be inclined to ignore if you don't do practical criticism. And another feature, I guess, is that reading is a skill. Yeah. And I think it's something that people take for granted. In particular, even if you're an English student, there are different ways to read, and if you don't practice reading, then you lose those skills. For example, even me in my third year, sometimes I forget to kind of actually use critical terminology to describe a particular feature in a text, because I'm not using a particular style of reading. And so practical criticism forces you to engage your formalist style of reading, which is always beneficial. I'm not the biggest fan of like a formalist critique or writing that purely ignores context, but I think the exercise of doing it is quite useful, especially for people who are really, really interested in kind of how we read literature and how it engages kind of cognitive processes in our minds. It's what's on paper that does that in particular, repetition, etc., rather than context. Context comes together in judgment and making decisions on how you feel about something, but how reading actually engages your mind, that's to do with the words and how they're constructed on the page, in my opinion.
Yeah, nice. So am I right in thinking that in one way it makes you stick to the text, and like the second thing is that the actual just consistent practice means that you no, I mean, I guess most people would know what it feels like to kind of have an opinion of a book, but you're practicing that skill of being much more analytical in a kind of English critic kind of sense.
Yes, you're always steeping your opinion in what's written down rather than kind of talking around it or making comments based off like context that you know. For example, one thing that I guess before doing my degree at Cambridge was that I would fall into the trap of saying, oh, this book is good because I like it because of these features, and also because the author has all this context. And I would fall into the trap of thinking the author's life is more interesting than the book itself, or allowing that to like provide a bias in my opinion of the text. And so some books I look back on and I'm like, actually, from a literary perspective, it's really not that good, but I really liked it because of who the author was, etc.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I guess it's really easy to say something like, I really like Shakespeare because of da da da, but I can't think of the last time someone specifically said, oh, it's because of like these passages or these like sentences that I really liked and how he wrote it that I think is great. Normally people just, as you said, talk around it.
Yeah. And so practical criticism forces you to, it's such a mouthful all the time. We abbreviate it to prac crit.
Okay.
Or some people call it PCCP. It depends on, I guess, your college that you go to.
Yeah.
For example, yes, Shakespeare. There are some Shakespeare texts I don't like, and I would always be like, yeah, I don't like it, it's so boring. But practical criticism forces you to kind of say, why is it so boring?
Yeah.
What is the reason that you find it boring? What is Shakespeare doing in this play that you like that he's not doing in this play that you dislike?
I guess it also gives you power to dislike texts that are seen as like, I don't know, as normally seen as like really good, but you can actually specify why you personally don't like it as much.
Yes, definitely. I think I've disliked more practical criticism extracts than I've liked them, which is quite funny.
Yeah.
But it's because you look at something and you're really analysing it and you're thinking what's good about it and what's not good about it. And so that's the other feature, the feature of identifying what's missing from a text. You can only do that if you look really closely at the actual composition of writing. And I think a lot of people who are interested in English literature are also interested in writing their own pieces, whether that be fiction or non-fiction. I think prac crit is a good exercise in developing those skills, even as a writer, by critiquing other people's writing purely based off what they've written. Because when you write yourself, you're not thinking about the context of yourself and how it enhances a reading. You're thinking about what you've put onto paper.
Am I right in thinking that like the whole idea of like part of the idea of prac crit is like like combating against the culture of people talking about books, but never like talking about books that they haven't read? Because I think that's quite like a common culture, and I can imagine like in a dinner party, people like to talk about stuff that I know were like important authors, and then you scratch beneath the surface and realize that they haven't actually read what they're talking about. Does this kind of put the text in the center stage?
Definitely. Practical criticism is meant to put the text at the center stage, and it's quite hard to like make big grand statements on books that you haven't read from that perspective, because then you'll be asked to provide quotes or pieces or features that you've recognized in your reading.
Yeah, nice. Okay. That was a massive mouthful for me to get out. Just seeing what's next. Okay. I also noticed that in the third year there's a compulsory paper in the English course on tragedies, and I've prospective students, when they're looking at the course, they'll notice that as well. I was wondering, why is there like a specific focus on tragedies?
I did tragedy last time, so it's very fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
I think that tragedy, it's a huge component of what makes up the literature that we know. And so you have really, really well-known texts that have inspired many, many generations of literature, and they all go back to tragedy, or degrees of tragedy in shaping what we know to be of tragedy. And so the paper itself, when you study it, there are two compulsory elements. One being that you have to write about Greek tragedy, and the other being you have to write about Shakespearean tragedy. Outside of that, you can write about tragedy in any way, shape or form, be that film, literature, theatre, etc. Any kind of form of media that ties itself to tragedy is allowed to be explored in that paper. And you can also write about translated fiction. So you can write about fiction in translation, because tragedy is not just English. It's not just Western. You can talk about a range of things. And I think it's because, not just because tragedy is deeply steeped into literature, but because tragedy I guess, is an inherent part of the way that we look at life, and it's a word that we often use. And so looking at it from this kind of very, very macro perspective, and then dividing up into different categories is what we do in that paper. You look at tragedy in this light and in this light, and what constitutes a tragedy is quite hard to define once you finish the paper itself. And you, well, such a hard question. I might like restart.
That's okay. I mean, I can edit it.
Cool, that'd be perfect. Why do we study tragedy? It's so. The implication of the tragedy paper is that tragedy is something that should be studied. And when you read all the literature and the fact that tragedy is something that has been in literature from the very beginning, hence why one of the components of the paper is study Greek tragedy. And that's not me saying Greek tragedy is the beginning of literature, because that's a very kind of Western perspective on it. And the paper encourages you to look outside of Western perspectives by looking at translated fiction. But the idea is tragedy is something that transcends time and it's trans-historical, and it also crosses borders. It's not just Western. It's also, we can find pieces of tragedy in literature, in media across the world. And so the idea is this is such a huge component of the way that we live. The notion that tragedy is inherent to living. So you spend a whole paper analysing the different ways that this has been explored by people. And it really plays into key concepts you learn over the course of your first 2 years of the degree. One being of mimesis, which is a concept by Aristotle. The idea that everything that people write is kind of just a mimicking of what people have written before. And so the tragedy paper kind of, you bring in that skill of learning about mimicry and rewriting, because you have the same tragic plots reappear from Greek tragedy in modern day tragedy. Another component that we have to study is Shakespearean tragedy. And with Shakespearean tragedy, you can't put it next to Greek tragedy and say that they're the same, because they're very, very different. But what does connect them is the fact that they're both tragedies. And so now you're comparing and contrasting two types of tragedy. I think the reason we study is because it's so fruitful as a topic to study. And it's one of the only topics, I guess, you could really study with such a large scope, where everyone can be taught the baseline and then take it in any direction. It's quite hard to teach a baseline for other papers that's not steeped in history. So for our other papers, for example, medieval, for early modern, etc., your baseline or your learning is steeped in context. Whereas for tragedy, it's much more conceptual, and you're venturing into kind of literary theory and wider ideas of philosophy in that paper.
Nice. Wow, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting how there's a paper that's not designated to any period, as you say, like it's a paper that's based on a concept. Now a bit more about what you're studying. What modules have you chosen to do?
So this term I'm doing contemporary writing in English, and I'm also doing post-colonial and related literatures. Nice. And those are the two papers I've been so excited to study these from the very beginning of my course. I think for me, I always lean towards contemporary writing in my personal reading. And I've always wanted to study books that I have loved in an academic sense. For example, my dissertation last year was on the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which is a really contemporary piece about, it's science fiction. It's a really cool novel, and I love reading things that, I guess, deliver a message and you're learning through the novel, etc. And that's something academically I have a huge interest in, but it's one of those things that you don't really get a chance to study or explore unless you do an English degree. And so it was really cool to have a supervisor who I could do this really contemporary piece of work with, and there was a place for it in scholarship. And so that's why I chose a contemporary paper, because I wanted to do more of this. I'm interested in what people are reading now, what we're holding up as good literature, and also what constitutes bad literature. What do we think of being signs of illiteracy in the modern day? If people are reading, are they still literary if the book itself is something that doesn't require a large amount of skills to be able to understand? And so that's I'm hugely fascinated by that, and I'm very excited to be doing the contemporary paper. and the other paper is post-colonial and related literatures. And with that paper, you have you pick 2 regions of interest that you study, and you have supervisors for, and it's very kind of seminar focused. You have quite a few seminars, and you have class discussions where you look at, I guess, like in tragedy, it's more the building blocks are theoretical. You're thinking from a theory perspective and a philosophy perspective, and then you go into your different regions and you take that theory from the general seminar that you have to attend, and you specify it to regions. So my primary region is African literature, in particular East Africa, because I'm from East Africa, and I thought it's really nice to be able to have the chance to study something that you wouldn't have had a chance to before. So I'm very excited for that. And then my second region is Palestine and Swana related literatures, which is very cool. There's quite a few supervisors and professors who are very well versed in literature of the area, and I've always had an interest in the region. So very excited to be studying that. Those are my 2 papers that I'm happy to be studying. Although I think at the end of the term I'll be very tired.
Yeah, of course. And I'm right in thinking that if you study English at Cambridge, you also get to write a dissertation?
Yes. So I mentioned I did my dissertation last year on the Broken Earth trilogy. That in second year you do a 5,000 word dissertation. So in my head it's a long essay, but you research it, you have supervisions, and you put in as much time as you would for a longer dissertation. And then in third year you have another dissertation, but that's 7,000 words, and you get to do your third year dissertation on anything. Whereas in second year your dissertation is substituting a paper.
Yeah, okay.
So when I was in Michaelmas of first year, the paper I did was paper 7, and that was so long ago. By the end, by now that it was so long ago that when it came to second year, I was like, I can't do an exam on this paper. I should just do a dissertation. And because my interest is in contemporary literature, it worked quite well to make my dissertation my passion project. But a lot of people do typically pick to substitute the first paper they ever studied at Cambridge for a dissertation, because you don't really have a high quality of work from that term, because you're trying to get to grips with the Cambridge system, and your supervisors are very much like easing you into it. So I have like a handful of essays from my first term here that were very formative, but I would really hate to have been revising from them last term.
I see. So it gives you like a second chance to do it again.
Yeah.
Nice. So like a lot of prospective students who like watching this will be trying to work out what degrees to do, and a common dilemma for students is choosing between English and history. And I was wondering, like, what advice would you have for students who are trying to choose between studying English or history at university?
I think the important thing to consider between history and English is what particularly you're interested in history. For example, if you're interested in doing, I guess, papers that look at a broader range of history outside of England, then you might find a history degree more fruitful, because there are more options specifically to look outside of English history. However, if you're interested in looking at the dynamic between history and literature, and the way that you think about history is from a literary perspective, then an English degree would equip you with the skills to do that better, because all of our papers are, to an extent, history papers, because the full title is English Literature and Its Contexts. So that point of in its context, that means you have to know a substantial amount of history for any of your papers in first and second year. So it really depends on whether you really like to look at history through the lens of what people were writing about, and what fiction they were creating, and how the writing of the time reflected the politics. Outside of that, if you're more broadly interested in historical sources and a range of, I guess, historical things, then a straight history degree might be better. But there's always room for overlap in both subjects.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So am I right in thinking that you're saying if someone is really interested in like primary sources and primary sources outside of England, and getting into them, and kind of a, I guess, more traditional approach to history, they might be more suited towards a history degree, whereas someone else who is more interested in recent historians who are kind of looking at less, I don't know, as you were saying, like more more closely aligned to the theory side of using it as a lens, then they might consider English.
Yeah, so like historicism is like a huge element of the English degree. We're always looking at the past and trying to learn what we can from the literature, and that's the history that we do in English. For example, this is so random, but Dr. Ali Lukes, who recently received her PhD in olfactory ethics, which is like looking at smell and its politics throughout history. That's an English degree that like it's an English PhD that she's done it in, and she's looked at sources from literature to make this point about sociology and also history. So that's like I guess a really good example of how English is a medium to explore history and sociology. And so if you're someone who likes to kind of do very interdisciplinary work but wants to steep it in writing and literature doesn't have to constitute fiction, poetry alone. It could be nonfiction, it could be prose, etc. That it's a very good degree for that, and getting the skills to do that. For example, I did sociology and geography and English for my A levels, and I don't regret doing English as doing English as my degree, because I constantly do sociology and I constantly employ geographical ideas in my writing.
Nice. And I guess a lot of the thinkers with like sociology and English and English and history, they overlap.
Yeah. It's like Karl Marx. He's across all of the degrees.
Yeah, of course. Nice. And another dilemma that students face is that in a given year they have to choose between applying to Oxford or Cambridge, and for a lot of degrees, the degrees are like completely different, so the choice is quite straightforward. But you could study English at Oxford or at Cambridge. I was wondering if you had any advice for students when they're trying to make the choice between the two universities.
Yeah, I think I had a friend who is, I think, in a year or two below me, who was thinking of applying to Oxford or Cambridge. And from speaking to her, I think the difference is in the order that you study things in. It differs slightly at Cambridge than at Oxford. I think at Oxford you study from your first year, you study a different range of papers, and you are examined on those papers at the end of first year. And it's quite a lot more papers. Whereas in English, here at Cambridge, your first year is very much like bringing your skills together. So you're not really doing more than one paper a term. Whereas to my understanding at Oxford, that's slightly different. You're doing, I guess, like a few more different things at the same time. And so if you're someone who wants to kind of really like have a huge range from the very beginning, Oxford might be a good choice for you if you want to be doing a lot of different things at like similar times, and like to have options when you're studying. For example, if you're doing one paper at Cambridge, it can get a bit boring. You're like, oh, all term I've been looking at the same period. If you're someone who you wouldn't like that, maybe Oxford might be a better fit. And at the end of our year at Cambridge in first year, you only sit one exam, which is a practical criticism exam, and then you do a 3-essay Shakespeare portfolio. So it's a very kind of relaxed first year. You really, really refine your skills. Whereas from speaking to my friends at Oxford, they had a lot more going on in their first year. So it just depends on, I guess, how much you want to learn, how quickly. All first years don't count for anything at both universities. But I guess the course at Oxford it's much more fast-paced from the very beginning, whereas Cambridge really like eases you into it. So that's one of the main differences. We do a similar range of papers. They don't have practical criticism as we do here. They have similar classes that look at the same ideas, but it's not as consistent as every week. It's kind of a module that they take one term or every other term at Oxford.
So yeah, that's interesting. So if someone was listening to this and they really liked the idea of the practical criticism, then Cambridge would be
a good fit, because you do it throughout your entire degree. And the thing about practical criticism is that you don't really have to prepare for it. Like you get given reading and you read a couple articles, but you can also just mostly come to the class and engage with the piece of work with a fresh mind. So it doesn't take a lot from your degree itself or the papers that you're doing alongside it.
Nice. I also know that in the first year in Oxford that they do Anglo-Saxon English but there is you can also do that in the Cambridge course, right?
Yes, you could do it in the Cambridge course if you would like to take a paper from the ASNAC department, and a lot of people after doing the medieval paper consider that as an option. And studying, I guess, like Old English is always an option in the English Tripos itself, because we have papers that are earlier than the medieval paper itself, but those papers are optional in your third year. So this year, for example, instead of choosing contemporary, I could have chosen medieval supernatural or early medieval literature if I really, really liked medieval. I enjoyed medieval a lot. It's just not my particular academic niche. But some people do like it and they choose to do that. So there's always a scope to kind of go further into what you like. But Cambridge makes you really like develop those skills for the first 2 years, so that when you come to the papers you really wanted to learn about, you already have the skills. So you can just focus on learning and enjoying it.
Nice. Well, thanks, Nadia. Really interesting conversation about English. I'm sure that'll be really helpful for a lot of the students applying and thinking about what course to choose. And thanks for the viewers for watching, whether it's on YouTube or your podcasting platform. We'll see you guys next time. Oh, how was that?
Get it all. I always forget, like, it's so awkward filming.
Yeah.